Um, I'm interested in how people used to describe fairies, as far back into the past that we have accounts. What were their descriptions of fairies physically, from those days, and what kind of stories did they used to tell about them?
Well, I'll give you one example, which always I think really hits people between the eyes when I explain this. If you get today a class of 20 or 30 children, and you say to them, as one of my colleagues did, everyone draw a fairy. 29 of the 30 children will draw a picture of a small humanoid with wings. And yet, this idea of fairy wings is very, very recent in history. It's difficult to go much further back than about 200 years with the idea that fairies had wings. And if you talk to someone, say, in Shakespeare's time, remember that Shakespeare himself includes fairies in 3 of his plays.
Mhm.
Um, no one had this idea that fairies had wings. Wings were something that only angels had. And I think that when you look back at the images of fairies through the centuries, the one thing where there is a kind of constancy, where we get repeated references to this, is the idea that fairies are relatively small. But that doesn't mean, as we often think today, necessarily butterfly small, or say the size of an owl. The lots of traditional references, particularly from Britain and Ireland, have fairies which is, say, the size of a 10-year-old child or a 12-year-old child. And
Mhm.
it has to be said, there are also references where fairies are identical in appearance to normal human beings.
Yeah, I've read quite a few accounts where the fairies, appear almost identically to humans, except maybe there's some sort of detail that's kind of off.
Yeah,
They'll have there's some hint that they're not quite human. And I've been some of the stories that some of my subscribers here have shared with me have told of fairies like this. So these are even in modern people's modern encounters, we have encounters of life-sized, human-sized fairies.
yeah, there's absolutely, you're absolutely right. There's no question about this. And one of the great 19th century fairy writers, the Irish poet W.B. Yeats, has a lovely sentence where he says, fairies can be whatever size they want to be.
Yeah.
And this is certainly true in the descriptions we have of people meeting fairies. And indeed, I would say that idea that fairies are human size is particularly common from Ireland.
Hmm.
Um, Going back to the 19th century, that's where you get the most references to human-sized fairies. And you were also saying in recent times, fairies are often seen as normal size. You mentioned at the very beginning that I've been involved in the fairy census. There was this collection of 500 different sightings of
Hmm.
fairies in modern times. And it's certainly interesting there that there are lots of descriptions of people coming face to face with beings or entities that they described as being about their size. But then there are also lots of descriptions of people having encounters with entities that are actually really quite small.
Yeah, well, I definitely, people submit me a lot of stories like that as well. But I'm
Mm.
interested in, what were fairies understood to be historically? Like, what are fairies? What do people believe that they are, and how has that changed?
Well, I think the first thing to say, the first part of the question, is that there was this idea that fairies were, a phrase that you will know well, was scary. There was
Mhm.
this idea that fairies were not all sweetness and light, that they had to be taken very seriously, that they could cause damage, that they could hurt human beings. Um, and there was also this idea that fairies could also help human beings. So they weren't demons. They weren't creatures that were unambiguously bad, but there was this sense that they could be good or bad depending on their moods, depending on their own private rules. And one of the slightly alarming things about fairies, in traditional accounts, is that you often get this sense that for people living in farms, in small communities dotted around the countryside, fairies rules were very, very strict. The fairies had a series of rules that humans were expected to follow, and if they didn't, things could get very serious very quickly. And I mean, the example I'm deliberately giving you here shocking examples,
Sure.
but in 19th century Ireland, we have lots of references to children being killed because a family had not respected fairy laws. For example, if you lived in Ireland in 1870, dotted around the countryside, still today, there are what were called fairy forts. And on those fairy forts, very often thorns grew, and those thorns were believed to be the special property of fairies. And, God forbid that you should chop down one of these thorns, because if that happened, your 5 or 6 children would be killed. I mean, they would die one by one. And so I think that that's just a reminder that people who used to come into contact with fairies had not just respect for fairies, but really a very great fear for fairies.
Yeah, I've also read about people, sort of lining up their front door and their back door so fairy processions can go through. Is that something that's familiar to you? I don't know
Yeah,
where I
I
like.
mean, we get hints of this from Britain, but the place you find it most of all is Ireland.
Mm,
And there is the idea that the fairies have special roads, and these roads are typically straight and they line up between different places where fairy groups, we could almost say fairy tribes, are supposed to live. Because another of the important things in Irish folklore, but we get quite a lot of this in British folklore too, is that the fairies are constantly fighting each other. There's a kind of a Game of Thrones thing going on there between the different factions of fairies. And when you built a house in the Irish countryside in the 19th century, it was very important to be sure that you didn't accidentally build on a fairy roof, excuse me, a fairy route, because
mhm.
that was a sure way to annoy the fairies. And there is, I don't know if you've ever come across this, but it's worth you and perhaps your listeners looking out for this. There's a lovely photograph, and I think it's in McManus's book on the fairies, where there's a 19th century Irish house that's missing a corner because the family had a series of tragedies in the family. The local, let's say, fairy doctor, this was the 19th century Irish term for people who could talk and interact with fairies, told them that they'd accidentally built the house on a fairy track. And at this point, they removed the corner of a house so the fairies could have free access. And at that point, the run of bad luck that the family had been having ceased.
Wow. And what's the name of the book again? I'll put any books that are mentioned in the stream in the description. So if anyone's interested in those books and wants to pick them up, they
Right.
can do so. So
Yeah, this is one of the very best fairy books from the 20th century. Um, and it's I've made the mistake. This is typical amateur hour on my part. I've made the mistake of standing up and pulling out my speaker.
that's all right. Live broadcast. Anything can happen. Like
This is it's a book by Damien McManus.
Damon
And
Manis.
it's called oh, I'm going to walk across the room and just have a look.
You
This
know
is the
what?
price
That's all right. We can put
of having a cold.
we can do it after the stream. Like, because
Okay.
what I'll do is any books that are mentioned, I'll go and look over them, and then in the end, I'll do a list below.
Anyway, it's Damien McManus, and it really is a fabulous book. It's called The Middle Kingdom. The Middle
Oh, the
Kingdom.
Middle Kingdom. That's great. Is that where?
And I think that your listeners will particularly enjoy this because it's just so full of fairy experiences. It's not just folklorists talking about fairy theory, it's people actually describing lived experiences.
Yeah, and that's definitely what my channel is all about. So
Yeah.
yeah, that's the right audience for that.
Mm.
I'm interested in what sort of places specifically, fairies are associated with. I know that they're associated with nature, the farm and that kind of thing. But also, are there places that you found through the fairy census, for example, where there are particular hotspots or hubs of fairy activities where you get more people reporting experiences than others, that sort of thing?
Um, Yeah, that's an interesting question. One thing I'd start by saying is you started off with this interesting comment that fairies are particularly associated with natural places, and I said something similar before. But even that you could play around with as an idea. I think fairies are particularly associated with places, which isn't necessarily quite the same thing. And we do, for example, in British and Irish tradition, again in both countries, have this idea that some kinds of fairies, and remember there are different kinds, are particularly associated with actual human habitations.
Mhm.
Britain, for example, has a type of fairy called the hob, and the hob or hob um, was particularly, it was believed to live in or near certain houses, and this fairy would become, they always lived on their own, but they were fairies who had a relationship with the human family, and they would help the family, or sometimes they would become angry with the family. And then, like you say, there were also places in the countryside, particularly associated with fairies. And I think that these are places that I always think of them as being charismatic places.
Mhm.
Sometimes they're a lake, sometimes they're a hill, sometimes they're a wood. But for one reason or another, the local community has come to believe that these places are special. Many years ago, I was in Ireland, and I was with an Irish woman and an Italian friend, and we were driving through the countryside. And this woman suddenly said to I and my Italian friend, you know, this is a place here. And she pointed to a crossroads. She said, I've never seen a fairy, but I've always thought that if I was to see a fairy, it would be here. And clearly, in this woman's mind, driving backwards and forwards to Dublin every day, this place registered in some way as being a powerful place. And this is something that I particularly find just fascinating. Why is it certain places? I live in the Italian hills in the Apennines, have very wild countryside roundabout. Why is
Mhm.
it that some places that I walk through have this just a sense of they have a kind of a feel to them that's a little bit weird. And for this, you do not need to believe or not believe in fairies, because this feeling is something which, you know, which is there. I mean, for example, I walk with my dog, and I'm always struck that my dog at certain points becomes a little bit wary. There are places that, for whatever reasons, buzz very strongly on our internal radar.
I think a lot of us have had that kind of experience, you know, even those who haven't had any kind of fairy or supernatural experience where you're walking in a forest or something like that, and you just feel like there's a certain magic present, you know, like you are watching the trees and the trees are sort of watching you.
Yeah, it's I've never understood. I guess I'm a very kind of nuts and bolts person, and I'd love to have someone really explain this to me. But I've never really understood why certain places have this feel. But you know, it might have to do with just something as simple as their angle to sunlight.
Mhm.
You know, the fact that you can see them from certain angles, the change in the light as you're walking through them, maybe micro differences in temperature. I mean, I'm being very overly rational here, but I think what we can all agree on, and this is something that everyone can agree on, all the way from fairy believers all the way through to people who are ardent materialists, and, you know, do not see any other dimensions in life, is that these places exist, and we'd explain them in different ways. But this probably goes back to our experience as hunter gatherers thousands and thousands of years ago. There are these places that just light up in our heads, and that we get to know. At the moment, I'm doing another project about the supernatural that isn't primarily about fairies. But one of the exciting bits about this project is I've taken 11 different English villages from the 19th century where people have written very good descriptions of local supernatural forces. And what I've done is I've got the maps of the 19th century and put these forces onto the map. And it's fascinating to see the way that in the 19th century, if you lived in the countryside, any village would have anything between a half dozen and a dozen of these places that had a reputation. And sometimes the reputation was because of a ghost, sometimes because of a fairy, but it was known that these places were special.
They're like sort of hot spots as I was saying,
Hotspots.
yeah, and I
Yeah,
mean, it
yeah.
doesn't